Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Blacklight series presented by For Viola in partnership with the Doc Institute. My name is Julian Carrington, and I work with Hot Docs, where, among other things, I am a programmer of the For Viola series. Before we welcome our esteemed guests, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Hot Docs is a settler-run organization and that we are based on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, as well as the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty that initially bound the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and settler newcomers have been welcomed into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this place, a place that we continue to share with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Wherever you are joining us from, I encourage you to reflect on your relationship to that land and also to consider taking action in support of First Nations communities, whether that be by contributing funds to Indigenous land defenders, supporting an Indigenous arts organization local to you, or offering some other form of support in a way that is meaningful to you. And it is now my privilege to introduce our two guest filmmakers who also happen to be recipients of the Documentary Organization of Canada's 2021 Doc Honors Awards. Firstly, it is a great pleasure to introduce Sylvia D. Hamilton, co-director of Black Mother, Black Daughter, and recipient of the 2021 Doc Rogers Luminary Award. Sylvia was chosen for the award in recognition of a career of pioneering achievement in the documentary field that has now spanned over 3 decades. She was a member of the NFB's Transformative Feminist Production Unit Studio D, and also co-founded the New Initiatives in Film program, creating storytelling opportunities for women of color and First Nations female filmmakers. Sylvia's filmography could, in and of itself, stand alone as a Black History Month series. In addition to Black Mother, Black Daughter, it includes Speak It, From the Heart of Black Nova Scotia, Portia White, Think on Me, and The Little Black Schoolhouse. Sylvia, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you.
I am also delighted to be joined by Tamara Dawit, Director of Finding Sally and recipient of the 2021 Doc Vanguard Award. The Vanguard Award celebrates filmmakers whose work embodies the future of the medium, and in Tamara's case, reflects both her directing achievements and I'm sure also her contributions to the wider industry as one of the founders of the Racial Equity Media Collective, a national not-for-profit organization committed to equity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color creators in Canada's film and television media industries. Tamara, congratulations to you as well. It's really wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you for including me.
Jumping into the conversation, Sylvia, I'd love to begin with you. A film like Black Mother, Black Daughter is such an ideal fit for Black History Month, both because it's historical in its perspective, but also because it in and of itself is historic as the first film from the NFB's Atlantic Canada branch with an all-female crew. When I look at your filmography, it's clear to me that elevating and preserving undertold histories has always held importance to you. Where does that importance come from for you?
Thanks for that question, Julian. And I first must acknowledge my co-director on Black Mother, Black Daughter, Claire Prieto, a legend in and of herself in terms of the work that she's done. When I was growing up, I learned nothing in school about my ancestry. I learned some things within my community from elders and from others who were in the community surrounding me, but there was nothing in my school textbooks. And I had a strong curiosity to find out, where did I come from? Where did my people come from? How did we get to this little village in Nova Scotia? And I found that my ancestors were refugees from the Canada-American War of 1812, Black refugee survivors. And when I found out about who they were and how they came to Nova Scotia, and that their story had not been told, and that I was a direct descendant from them and the recipient of their struggle for freedom, that really set me on a course to begin thinking about how I might not only tell their story, but the stories of those who came after them and the contemporary people from of African descent across Canada.
And when I was preparing for this conversation, I read about actually your early days at school and was dismayed that I was only also discovering this so belatedly. But your first school experience was in a segregated school. Is that correct?
It's correct. It's a fact in Canadian history that is not talked about. The fact that we had in both Nova Scotia and Ontario, by law, segregated schools, all Black schools. And in Nova Scotia, particularly because the Black communities that were settled were spread out around the province, each little village had its own school. And that was by law. It was both law and geography, and also in Ontario. In other parts of Canada, there were a few schools, but not nearly as many as in Nova Scotia. So my first experience in school was in an all Black small village school. And my mother was a school teacher as well in all Black segregated schools. My documentary, The Little Black Schoolhouse, indeed tells the story of the segregated schools, the teachers who taught there, how they came to be. So the idea that in this country called Canada, a country that is supposed to be a democratically established community, society, that children were segregated on the basis of race is something that people have denied. But I'm a witness to that. My mother, all of the people who went to those schools are witnesses to struggle and resistance for equality in education particularly.
Yeah, I certainly encourage anyone watching to seek out that film as well. Obviously we are proud to be presenting the 6 films as part of the series, but I'm personally hoping that this can be a gateway to delve beyond and certainly further into your filmography, Sylvia. What was it? Sorry, go ahead.
If I might say that often in Canada, we think that segregation only happened in the United States, happened in South Africa. And it is a matter of the denialism of the fact that we had racial segregation. And racial segregation is a direct legacy from the enslavement of African people in this country. Mm-hmm. So that's the root of it. So thank you for that question.
Not at all. I'm curious what it was like for you to tell Black focused stories within the Canadian film industry earlier in your career. We're talking about the late 80s, the early 90s into the 2000s. Even in the last year and a half, we've heard so much about barriers faced by racialized creators in Canada, and we're seeing some very belated efforts made to reduce those barriers. But I can only imagine what the landscape looked like 30 years ago when you were starting out. So was it difficult to find support for the sorts of films that you were interested in making?
It was difficult. It was a singular activity in many ways. When I think about it, going to film festivals, going to meet with agencies, only person there of color, only Black person there. And there was one other colleague, the late Errol Williams from New Brunswick, Marty Williams, who worked in cable, but that was it. And I think for me, because I come from this long line of struggling people who were very much attuned to opening doors, trying to do the best they could, I realized that regardless of who was in that room, I was going in. And so trying to convince agencies to support the films was really not an easy effort. And I think one of the questions often came up was, well, why should we do this film? We did one maybe 2 years ago. So the idea that we did one already. I must also take a moment to acknowledge the late Phil Fraser, who was the president of Vision TV, a heavyweight in the film industry in Canada. And Phil was very, very encouraging and very supportive. So I point to him as someone who was a mentor to me and someone who was strongly encouraging me to keep going. And then the Black Film and Video Network in Toronto, it was really wonderful to have Claire and Roger McTair and Glace Lawrence to be able to connect with them. But out here in the Far East, it was pretty slim on the ground.
I can imagine. But I'm glad you touched on mentorship there, because Tamara, I wanted to ask you, as you began your own career in filmmaking, were you aware of artists like Sylvia and her body of work? Did you have role models within the Canadian industry that you looked up to?
Yeah, I did not know anything about Sylvia until we won this award together. And I think that is telling of the issue. That's like really, really not good. And I think there's a huge, and it's not even a generational disconnect. I'm always struggling to meet and connect with other racialized or Black filmmakers in Canada. I think it's only been maybe in the last couple of years, because of the sudden interest in racial equity, that we've started to connect more. But all the things that Sylvia described, going to events, you're the only Black person in the room, going to pitch a broadcaster or any sort of institution in this sector, there's rarely ever anyone there that looks like me and understands what I'm talking about. So it's frustrating to also to listen to what Sylvia is talking about, and what I've heard many other members of the Black industry in Canada talk about. This is the same thing that's been going on since the 80s and the 90s. We've asked for all these things many times, and now I'm sitting here going through the same thing, but it's still trying to push for change.
Yeah, I was going to ask that next, is sort of, having heard Sylvia describe her experience, how does your experience compare? And obviously there are some unfortunate similarities, I suppose. Did you have any sort of particular challenges in pitching a film in Finding Sally that is rooted in a Black diasporic identity, in terms of pitching that to Canadian funders? Was there a unique challenge there, did you find, or were people sort of receptive to this idea that this could be a Canadian story as well?
No, I think there's all of the issues that Sylvia outlined, in terms of, we've already had a Black story. Also the issues I found of being a woman and then being a Black woman. No one wanted to work with me. They wanted to work through some white person who they'd worked with before, who they felt comfortable with, who was, in their peer group. So there were those issues that I know many racialized and Indigenous filmmakers face. But then there was the additional issue of, well, this is a story about someone in Africa. And everything I had in my slate that I was pitching was stuff that was set in Africa, because that's really always been my focus and my area of interest, to sort of dig into my history in Ethiopia and Eritrea and my family's backstory. But I was always fighting to make it Canadian, to Canadianize it. That's why I'm in Finding Sally. Me being in the film was not at all part of the pitch. But I really had to go in armed with data, like, this is how many Ethiopians are in Canada. Told the CBC, you're the national public broadcaster. Ethiopians are the second largest Black African diaspora here. We've been here since the 50s and 60s. You've never produced content about us. I went in there like ready to fight. I don't know if that was part of what worked, but it's still difficult with the projects on my slate now to really relate. Why would Canadians want to or need to understand things from an African perspective, and not just the experience of Black communities in Canada?
Sylvia, I'm wondering, hearing Tamara speak in Black Mother, Black Daughter, you speak of your daughter Shani and your hopes for members of her generation, and your concerns as well. And I'm wondering, how do you feel today, sort of reflecting on the advances that have or have not been made?
I think that, I mean, I'm really, first of all, I want to say I'm so happy that I had a moment to watch Tamara's film. It is brilliant, heartfelt. The story was incredibly touching. And the thing that I wanted to say about it is I connected with it because I've thought about my ancestors who were also touched by war. Mm. And that connection of war, that connection of the diaspora. And so we're all really connected here. And I think the fact that often many Canadians don't think that there's a connection between people of African descent here and on the continent is a matter of extreme ignorance. And some of it is willful ignorance, if I might say. Mm. So I think when I see the younger emerging filmmakers today picking up whatever tool they have, whether it's a mobile phone, small cameras, to tell those stories, I am incredibly encouraged that they are trying to do that they are trying to go into their communities to make work, to make these stories be there for upcoming generations. Though the key question always is who's making the decisions in the institutions, and who are they? What do they look like? What do they know? What's their background? And I think that until we begin to crack the doors wider, until we begin to have people in those executive commissioning editor positions who have some understanding of the complexity of Black life across the diaspora, then we will still have those huge struggles. I mean, Tamara will still have the struggle to pitch stories that she has in her slate. So I think that it's not something that we can believe has completely changed. There are changes. More change, though, is needed.
Mm-hmm. Sylvia, I'm actually glad you brought up the actual experience of watching the film, because I did want to get into that, in addition to this conversation about the structure of the industry and sort of the opportunities to tell these stories, but also I wanted to talk about the stories themselves. Tamara, you mentioned that you weren't previously all that familiar with Sylvia's work, and yet I love that there's a continuity here between these two films, in that both focus on Black women who are leaders within their communities and sort of keepers of history within their families. We spoke a little bit earlier to Sylvia about where her inspiration came to tell these kinds of stories. I'd love to give you the same opportunity to just tell us a little bit about where the inspiration to explore this history came from for you.
I think it came from wanting to see more stories about my community told by people from my community. And then when I started investigating Ethiopian history, realizing that the people who are telling these stories in books, in interviews, in screen content are mostly men. So then I said, this is an opportunity to sort of look at how women tell history differently. And I think very similar to Sylvia's film, how women are sort of the keepers of our stories and the caretakers of those in our family. And I think that, women, we remember things from more a community perspective, and men often remember history from what they were doing and their experience, and they sort of tend to place themselves at the center of the story. So I really wanted to create a space for more content to be made about Ethiopians, but told by Ethiopians. And a lot of the content in my slate is from the perspective of women, from the perspective of minority communities, from the perspectives of young people, because those are the people we hear from the least within the Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora. So that was really my I guess, focus and inspiration. And I think it also just came from years of going to film festivals and seeing films about Ethiopia or about other parts of Africa that were made by white Europeans, and being like, what is this about? This doesn't make any sense to me. They've completely missed the essence of the point. They don't understand what's going on, and really wanting to push as a producer to bring forward a generation of filmmakers that are empowered and have the access and ability to tell their own stories.
I'm pleased that you had the opportunity to do so. Although, I think pushing that door wider is something that we've already touched on. You know, that's the struggle that we're engaged in now. So maybe this is an opportunity, Tamara, for you to speak a little bit about your work organizing within the industry and the sort of organizing that's happening among your peers via groups like the RAMC. What do you see as sort of the key opportunities or challenges of the moment?
I think the opportunities is, in some sense, maybe what you hinted at earlier, that people have suddenly decided to pay attention to the fact that there's systemic racism and anti-Black racism, and there are inequities in the screen sector. I think the challenge is how long will people remember to pay attention to that, and when will they move on to the next hot button issue? I think a lot of the work that I do, though, through the RAMC in Canada and as well through similar groups I work on in East Africa is really about policy change. A lot of the work of the RAMC in the last year has been focused on research around the importance of race-based data collection so that we can understand who's accessing the funds that are there, and also pushing for policy change with the federal government, specifically through Bill C-10, and now through the new version of this, which I imagine we'll be seeing in the coming next couple of days, to really make sure that monitoring and evaluation and the participation of people that look like us in decision-making roles is part of our legislation and part of how government decides to operate in terms of funding and control of the screen sector.
Yeah, I think that's such important work that you're involved in, and you know, just speaking personally as well as someone who wears another hat at Hot Docs on the funding side, that opportunity to be in the room, be around the table, reading projects with that perspective, that lived experience, it's so important. So, you know, I know that we are just one tiny element at Hot Docs of the funding picture in the country, but certainly it's something that is close to my heart. And yeah, I'm really inspired to see filmmakers organizing in this way and advocating for themselves. And yeah, I share your hope that the new attention perhaps to these issues is not short-lived, but is indeed enduring.
Might I
yeah, please.
In for a moment? I think that I congratulate you, Tamara, on that work, and would also say that it's a continuation of the work that many of us were doing in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s around policy changes and deep structural changes that we were calling for at organizations that used our tax dollars, such as the National Film Board, the Canada Council, CBC, and the demand that those organizations that were supposed to be representing us and using our tax dollars provided that opportunity for us to get in and to do the work that we were meant to do. And so I think that the challenges that many of us were involved in during that period, and the resistance that we also encountered, you know, was something that we didn't stop, even though there was resistance. There were efforts to keep that going. So I'm really pleased to see that work, the work that you're doing, is a continuation, so that we begin also to know our history, that this is not new. And one of the things I think can happen is organizations pretend that these things have never happened before, so that the corporate memory is gone. You know, remember sitting at a meeting of the Board of Governors at CBC back in this late 70s, talking about representation on CBC. So this is not new. And I think we also have a duty to remind those individuals who are in positions of power right now that it is not new and that we do not forget. And so the work that Tamara and her colleagues are doing right now is that continuation.
That's very well said. You mentioned there the importance of knowing our history. And so maybe by way of beginning to wrap up our conversation, in the spirit of the month and of the series, can I maybe ask each of you to speak to an aspect of Black history, a story, some media that you've seen that has captured your attention recently? Are there any books, podcasts, films that you might recommend to viewers who are interested in learning more or going deeper?
A lot. Well, what I would say is the series that's taking place now, looking at Blacks on the Prairies. That's a really important set of stories and work that is taking place right now. And actually it's all on CBC, on the website, because again, there's this mythology that there were no people of African descent, Black people in the West. And that is far from true. So the stories that are being uncovered and told there, I think, are really important and point to the complexity of our lives as African descendant people in this land called Canada.
Actually, there's a film within this series, John Ware claimed that speaks to that history. So you can see that within the series, and then go to the CBC for the rest of that series that Sylvia has mentioned. And Tamara, how about you?
I think my head is still, despite me physically being in Canada for the last year and a half, my head is still very much in Ethiopia. And I think just because I'm still doing so much screenings virtually with Finding Sally and conversations, and because of the ongoing conflict right now in Ethiopia, that's where my brain is. As soon as there's anything I'm reading, that's what it's about, because it's so much about reflecting on what's happening today and the ethnic divisions and what happened in the past, and really trying to continue to create dialogue about learning. I mean, I think intergenerational learning is partly the theme of this conversation, and also partially the theme of a lot of the conversations I have around Finding Sally, and another film I have in development that's a drama that's set within the same period, but from a different perspective.
Terrific. Well, then our viewers can eagerly anticipate that project coming to fruition. I think that's maybe the time we have for today. So I want to just, again, thank you both so much for your films, for all that you've done for the community, and for being here for this conversation. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you both.
Thank you. It's lovely to engage with Tamara and you, Julian.
And to those watching, thanks for tuning in, and we hope that you're able to enjoy more films over the course of the month. So thank you for that.